last time, in our discussion, we focused on various definitions of organization development, and then we were trying to discuss how we can bring about change in the organization and organization development as a field of interest. We will continue our discussion on this, but with a different focus today, that we will focus on organizational change and explore different dimensions of organizational change. We will also look at the OD, how it fits in the context of performance management. We have already discussed about the nature of performance appraisal and what kind of discussion should happen between the boss and the subordinates in the organization. But today we will take up organizational change, performance management, and then in that specific context, how OD plays a crucial role, how organization development enables various change processes within the organization. So the focus of today's discussion is the following. So in the end of this session, you should have learnt and understood the following: organizational change, the forms of organizational change, the analytical approaches to organizational change, how people have approached and managed change. Then we will move on to this performance management. Performance management in brief, so that we can contextualize the organization development. There we will see why do we do organization development, who does organization development, as well as are there any ethical values. So ethical values of an OD professional, and we will try and see how it is an important discipline driven by the trained persons. So let's look at more about the organizational change. So when we see organizational change, the concept is with regard to the organization wide change, as opposed to very smaller changes what we are talking about, like adding a new person or modifying a particular software to handle few things, or the changing of the office layout, things like that. So we are not talking about changes which are in small in nature or in its dimension, but we are talking about the organization wide change. So that means we are talking about organization as people, structure, processes and technology. So technology, process, structure and people as a whole we are trying to see, and whenever we are trying to alter in a bigger way, in its magnitude, when we see it is high, then we are referring it to as more of an organizational change, not those incremental and small kinds of changes. So when you are seeing examples of organizational wide change, it may include a change in mission and restructuring, that is where the organization tries to change its business model itself, we have talked about earlier, or restructuring the operations. So that means when you are highly product centric, you move away from product centric and then become more the process centric. So the examples of organization wide change might include a change in the mission and restructuring of the operations, like the restructuring to a kind of a self-managed teams. That means you create more empowerment in the organization, or there are major layoffs in the organization where you stop manufacturing a particular model, refocus on newer models, etc. So that means the organization wide change includes exploration into new technologies, or you are talking about mergers of that you take a company and acquire a company and then merge their culture into the other organization, major collaborations. People also use the word right sizing or downsizing or reduction of manpower in any organization talks about a major organizational change. And similarly, the new programs such as the total quality management, what people use this word TQM, or re-engineering. That means you look at all the processes within the organization, examine which are those processes are contributing to the value and which are those processes are not contributing to the value. That means what the customer would pay for, and then remove all the non-value added activities. So, the re-engineering, quality management, introducing set of new practices across the organization, maybe about the employee engagement processes or about the reward processes. So, whatever you change across, then we can see it as a kind of an organizational change. And in fact, some experts go one step further and then refer this organizational change as a basic transformation or a transformation of a fundamental and radical reorientation in the way the organization operates. So, that means they redefine the customer and the customer focus. We know that the segmentation every organization goes through in terms of providing its services. So, suddenly it assumes that no, they want to focus on a particular segment. If you look at Air Deccan, for example. So, the Air Deccan really segmented on the way they wanted to take this flying experience to the common man. But if you think that at a different point of exploration, they may change this focus and then they may move into high value customers. So, the question is that such change in focus talks about or demands an organizational transformation. That means the way they provide service, the way they take care of the customers. I think it's interesting to ask a question at this point of time: what provokes organizational change? What determines or what drives, what are the trends which forces the organization to look at the way they are operating, and they would like to prioritize to the future what they would like to do. So, it is in that sense one need to see change should not be done for the sake of change, but it is a strategy to accomplish some overall goals. So, that means the focus is not change per se, but people do feel today that in order to create that flexibility required in the organization, change should be pursued for its own value. So, that means continuously people are moved into newer work, newer tasks, and that's the way they would like to keep the organization always in a flux. But we are talking about most of the organizations where change is not done for the sake of change, but it is goal directed, it is efficiency directed, it is performance driven. And so, the change and performance coexist, and one need to evaluate how the changes brought about leading to some useful things. So, let us look at some of the reasons. So, what are the kind of driving forces? So, usually organizational change is provoked by one or the many of these outside driving forces. It could be a substantial cuts in funding for a university which depends substantially on the government support, on subsidies, and suddenly if the government says we will not be able to support completely, we will support only 60%, and you are supposed to earn the remaining part of the salary, I think then organization has to relook, that university has to relook the way they have charged the fees, the way they have managed the resources, and that would demand, yes, much more student friendly policies, customer centric kind of an approaches, or what we call a dialogue with the stakeholders, and many of such things. So, that means the organization starts questioning the kind of assumptions they have made in the past, and probably have or they will do redefinition of the stated policies, or would agree with whatever they have done in the past, may continue with it. So, it need to address major, or you can talk about the major stakeholders. Similarly, when organization is trying to rework on the markets and clients or existing clients, dependence may be very high. So when an organization was depending on a particular client for about their 60 to 70% of their turnover, and that your client customer is not doing so well, could mean that it would affect the health of the organization. And then really you have to see which are the newer markets and what are the new services you can provide. So the another important thing is need for dramatic increases in productivity, particularly when competition is very high. Others are likely to give the services which are far more effective, far more superior, but also has the kind of a cost dimensions in which they may offer their services maybe half of your cost, and that's the time where organization gets into the pressure. Where is that we need to trim down, where is that we need to focus, what is that we need to do, and things like that. So when you look at the organizational change, so the things which are coming from the outside forces have substantial influence on the organization. So the typically organization must undertake organizational wide change to evolve at different level in their life cycle. That is from going from a highly reactive entrepreneurial kind of an organization to more stable and also kind of a planned development. So the organization wide change, now one has to see what kind of things were there in the past, what kind of things are required to the future. I think such understanding, as we discussed in the last lecture, becomes much more relevant. Another reason could be the transition to a new chief executive. So that means a new CEO has come, new leadership has come, and again then it can provoke organizational wide change. So that means his her personality or the charisma or the style of functioning influences different levels, different functions, different activities in the organization, and that is how the organizational readjustments are necessary at all levels. The key individuals, key functions in the organization have to perceive the leadership and what the leadership wants, and similarly the kind of reorganization required at different levels to bring that required focus, required speed, or required quality of performance. But the question is whether it would be changing from one level of working to the other level, or adjusting to the leadership change, or making reorganization in relation to the environmental demands. All of this appears to be pretty easy, pretty simple, and one would like to ask this question, what is the problem? But this organization wide change, it is seen as very complex, and the several studies indicate that almost 90% of these changes are not successful. Most of the time they are failures. So failure stories are not really recorded and communicated, but most of the time only the success stories are shared. So always this question is, what is the difficulty, what is the problem? So the question we are moving into is, there are always strong resistance to change, and as set of people, as set of activities are initiated to bring about change, we will also see the kind of a corresponding resistance. And one of the major reasons for resistance to change is people are afraid of the unknown. So what is that future would be? What is that in it for me into that future? I think one of these or such of these questions, if not answered properly by the management, by the organizational processes, normally people resist change. And also the kind of attitudes people bring to the table. That is, many people think that things are already just fine, we are going fine. Life means, yes, there are some ups and downs, but really don't bother. I think we will get through these clouds or the rainy, whatever. So the kinds of reaction is, okay, let's postpone the action. So don't understand the need for change. They don't perceive what is happening outside the organization, and then over a period of time quickly they become irrelevant. So people, the way they perceive the change, the way they think about the change, and the way they redefine the change dimensions to their own personal effort of changing the style of functioning also has to be understood. Otherwise, you will see the people are not really linked to the change and change initiatives. Many are inherently, what people call it as cynical about the change, particularly from reading about the notion of change as if it is a mantra, because too many people talk about change, so they think that, okay, nothing is going to happen. Nothing is going to happen, nothing is going to affect their work, nothing is going to replace them. So such perceptions also influence that why people do not bother about change, or they don't get involved in the change process. And there are other issues is many doubt whether there are effective means to accomplish major organizational change. So the statements like illness is better than cure. So nothing really to be done because of these kinds of changes. So often there are conflicting goals also in the organization. So that is when people have to see that they have to increase resources to accomplish the change, at the same time they have to cut cost to remain viable. So the organizational survival, organizational continuity on the one hand, and then doing something new to generate newer resources on the other. So that's the time where large and complex organizations have to make decisions, but since the issues are made so conflicting, they tend to say, okay, let's continue as is. What people call it as status quo. The status quo kind of an approach comes into the system and system of practices. So what is important is to see that when conflicting goals are there, it is extremely important to prioritize and help the organization to move forward and bring about necessary changes in people and people attitudes, or introduction of newer technologies, or changing the structure which empowers certain people so that they can make more appropriate decisions, or change the processes of the organization where people get involved, people get communicate, and they can get engaged better with the organizational requirements and the goals. So it is important to see how the people are perceiving. An organizational wide change often goes against the very values held by held dear by the members in the organization. So that means in the past they have all worked as a team, and we have maybe in the training programs they are told team and team members and the relationships are important. But then when the reorganization has to happen, people have to move to different areas, and the team has to be broken, and maybe sometimes some people have to be thrown out, but the same values whatever was taught and it has become a part of the culture now comes in the way of change management. So that this may go against how members believe things should be done. So that the question is that this is how we have done in the past, and people articulate that as a value proposition, and they don't want to go against the kind of values they held, and then it is not easy to adjust. It could be about the payment of the fees, or imagine that university is working in the night shift, or working in 3 shifts. So suddenly it becomes a kind of a new paradigm, and it goes against the way that it has been handled in the past. So when organizations have to see some of these major changes in their approaches, so it is not only that they perceive the need for change, but within the organization the strong do's and don'ts, how certain things to be handled, how certain things should not be handled, gets defined, and those definitions are supported by the long practices not only within the organization but also whatever others have done, and then it becomes a problem and it comes as a kind of as a resistance to change. So it is this is how we see the things could be at the individual level, or it could be group level, or it could be organizational as a whole gets into the issues of resistance to change. So much of organizational change literature discusses needed changes in the culture of the organization. So that means you need to understand what is the work culture, how do they see change as, and are they comfortable in accepting newer activities, are they able to push new activities to meet the organizational goals, or are they careful? So question is that what are their values, what are their beliefs, what are their attitudes. So the attitudes, values and beliefs together can be defined as organizational culture. So the way they enact these values and beliefs, and how do they perceive the change as a threat or as an opportunity, or how do they perceive the organization as should be moving towards stable continuity kind of a paradigm, or radical experimental kind of a paradigm. So such approaches are necessary to understand, so that one can see what are the kind of resistance and what needs to be done. So the next question we need to ask is, how is organization-wide change best carried out? I think the successful change must involve top management. Today several studies have indicated that unless the top management involves, the top management understands, the top management commits itself to the change and change process, then only the change processes would be effective. So the successful change must involve top management, and there is a good understanding and appreciation of the initiatives and the efforts. So there is also next step, if you see, there is a champion. There is a champion who initially instigates the change by being visionary, by bringing the kind of resources, by telling the organization about the newer opportunities, or explaining the kind of processes and difficulties what is happening in the organization, and is persuasive and consistent. So what we see is the change demands the kind of leadership within the organization, one at the top management level, where they are prone towards understanding the change as well as thinking that changes are always important and necessary. And the other side is that you also require one product champion who is visionary, who can see the future, and then he has excellent communication skills where he can take the other people along, giving them a positive view of the future through persuasive communication skills, and he is consistent where people have that basic trust, basic understanding of the person. So we can also think about the change agent, and the change agent is usually responsible to translate the vision into realistic plan and carry out the plan. So that means the organizational top leadership and the product champion, they define that we would like this organization to adopt what people call it as world-class manufacturing practices. So that's a wish statement. Then that's the statement based on the vision, based on the experiences, whatever they have seen in other organizations, and now the change agent has to take those expectations, but then translate this into a communication plan, an involvement plan, maybe a demonstration plan or a kind of a rollout, so that others in the organization understand, appreciate, they get educated, they also get committed. So the change is usually best carried out as a kind of a team-wide effort. It is important that the set of intact people get involved, and then communications about the change should be frequent and with all organizational members. So, in different ways the need for change must be communicated. People also must have a chance to understand and express their own problems and difficulties. To sustain change, the structure of the organization itself should be modified. So, including sometimes the strategic plans, the policies and the procedures. So, the structure of the organization has to give a kind of an understanding of for the people about why are we talking about change. So, what people talking about the unfreezing. In an unfreezing situation, lot of comfort is given to the people, much more open-ended discussions and generating that kind of an alternatives, creating that kind of a required mental models, and then an actual change, and then the third step is called the refreezing processes. The unfreezing, change and refreezing is one of the classical models of the change management. The Kurt Lewin, when he talked about these three steps, then now it is so widely used, even though the concept came in 40s and 50s, and today it is an important way of understanding the change process as well as implementing the change processes at different levels. So, the best approach to address resistance is through increased and sustained communication and education. There is no other method. So, education, communication and participation help together to reduce the kind of resistance which can be coming at the psychological level or at the interpersonal level or at the group level or maybe organization as a whole, and building that kind of a required collaboration, building that kind of a trust, and the commitment of the top management in seeing the results of the change initiatives would always help in managing the change and the resistance to change at different levels. So, how one could do, there could be many examples, but the leaders should meet all the managers and the staff to explain the reasons for the change. I think that is the kind of a starting point. So, the top leadership in some situations, sometimes the important change managers at different levels, they need to meet and explain the reasons for the change. And also one need to say how it will generally will be carried out in a systematic way, and then in case if somebody wants more information, in case somebody wants to talk about it, what is it they can do. So, you also create a kind of a communication channel open for this. So, a plan should be developed and communicated. So, in other words, very clearly a step by step processes need to be stated, and then one can always change, but then it has to be communicated at all levels. Sometimes it is extremely important to create participative forums. Participative forums should be held for members of the organization so that they can express their own ideas, their own perceptions, their own difficulties of implementation about the plan. So, they should also be able to express their concerns and frustrations as well. They may ask, why should we do this now? Have we not spent some money? So, what happens to the previous investments and previous approaches? And if they have found certain things have not worked in the past, so they would like to explore those blocks, those challenges what they have faced in the previous efforts, or the kind of negative views if they have about the change initiative itself, and if they have some experience of the past where they were frustrated. So, such things they must be able to state it, they must be able to discuss those things openly so that they get proper answers. So, the question is the principal methods in which an organization change their form. What we are seeing is organization can change their relationship to their environments. In other words, redefining the environmental opportunity to position themselves to what is happening. In other words, when many customers are there, organization may redefine that one customer as most important and then create a division of activities towards that, and maybe the remaining ones focus on the all others. So they can see and understand the kind of pressures coming from one or more of the customers, or they can also see what we use this word, this one or more means homogeneous versus heterogeneous, and also they can relate to the nature of change which is coming. In other words, they are trying to see the rate of change is very fast, where people are continuously demanding newer technologies. So the markets and major stakeholders analysis always makes the organization to redefine. So by structuring or redefining, what we are trying to do is to see the identity and boundaries through which the organization responds. So then the mergers, acquisition, investments, alliances and partnerships all become relevant. So we have heard these word cartels. In some industries the cartels are necessary so that they create entry barriers to the new people. For example, the commercialization of drugs and drug developments always seen with respect to this kind of a cartels. Similarly, the oil prices are controlled by some of the significant players. So the question is that organizations do redefine, organization creates its own set of operational procedures and practices, or create higher standardization so that they are protected, and also they deal with the kind of changes whatever is coming in its environment. Organizational can change the ways in which they operate, the way the people and units relate to one another. So that means within the system, the reporting relationship can be altered, the way the people respond to that can be altered, because if they are not empowered, if there are not enough delegation of powers, so that means they will not be able to relate, so that you empower them so that they can respond better. So corresponding to their organic development over a period of time, one would bring these changes in the internal coordination. So as one can always see the age and size of the organization, initial changes, that is, if you see all people are moving with a very entrepreneurial, highly risk-taking mode, but soon they have to redefine who does what, who is responsible for what, and kind of a thing. But then you have to elaborate those structures in terms of the reporting relationships, definition of powers and things like that. But then you require some integrative kind of a mechanism. In the third and the fourth and the fifth stage, if you see, the organizational activities, the functions get much more specialized, more divisionalized and things like that. So the question is always, the organic development means we are talking about on the x-axis the age of the organization, and on the y-axis is the size of the organization. So as we are plotting this age and size, we do require continuous changes in the internal mechanisms, internal methods of coordination. And whenever you are making these kinds of changes, meeting the expectations of the people and the requirements of the activities and newer activities and the coordination of such activities, then we are referring these things to as a planned change. So the planned change is one which is always evolving and readjusting the organizational priorities and the practices. And similarly, the organization can change the nature of their control structures. So that means the parties involved in the dominant coalition of interests that govern the organization and also determine how benefits are distributed amongst them. So that means we are looking at different functions, sales, production, marketing. So the question is, these are all the kind of the major groupings. So how these groupings are there? How it could be regrouped so that the who is leading the organization also can be identified. So it is important to strike an appropriate balance between the internal factors of any organization and also the relating to these internal pressures, internal aspirations to the kinds of things what is happening the outside in terms of the forces which are driving the change. So once these two things are mapped properly, and that is how we are talking about the analytical approaches. So that means one need to see the kind of relationships, the kind of conflict, the kind of coordination failures, the kind of management of interdependencies within the organization, and also look at and map the organizational environment as heterogeneous versus the homogeneous, and also in terms of the time rate of change as the static or the dynamic situations, and then take all this into together, then map the environmental uncertainty, map environmental complexity, and also look at the internal capacities, internal attitudes, internal competencies, and bringing these two together would always sustain the work of the organization. In this context, one need to relook at the performance management. So that means when we are talking about organizational change and performance management, so the performance management we are talking about here is to introduce such practices, such processes where it is linked to the outcomes, it is linked to the deliverables, and as well as it is creating that kind of a required aspirations in the people to look for newer opportunities. So it's an integrated process of defining, assessing, and reinforcing employees' work behavior and the work behavior towards needed changes as well as the outcomes. So the performance management includes, we are talking about basically the goal setting, appraisal, as well as the reward systems. We have talked about this in the performance appraisal processes, but what is we are seeing here is linking this needed changes and then also the creating that kind of a reward systems where people see it as an opportunity and not as a kind of a threat. So we will have to relook at some of these concepts. So we are talking about the goal setting. So the goal setting specifies the kind of performance that are desired. So that means the organization would like to talk about, yes, we need to have newer service standards where people respond to the calls of the customer, people respond to or attend to the customer complaints. So there is a kind of a time frame within which they have to do these things. Or based on the features of the goal setting process, one can also talk about what is what is important in terms of the methodologies of implementing these things, either participative or it is group wise or the individual wise goal setting processes. So similarly, one need to do the diagnosis, which includes the business strategy, what are the kind of business models and business alternatives, and the way the workplace technologies are provided. So you need for newer technologies, and also the level of employee motivation, involvement, and engagement. So that means in performance management, we are focusing on all the elements: organization and its environment, organization and its people, and organization, people, and performance, and then seeing the technology, structure, strategy as a part of this whole system. Then preparing for goal setting. I think sometimes you have to train people. The training is extremely necessary for managers and employees to engage in goal setting. So that means they must be able to see what are the advantages of participative goal setting. They must understand how communication is extremely important, where people understand how to set the challenging and the meaningful goals. And in the performance management, goal setting becomes an important step. This step involves establishing the challenging goals, what people also call it as the stretch goals, and clarifying how the goals are going to be measured, and what is important for the individuals to understand the means and the also the ends and how it is going to be valued. And also the employees have to have a very high participation in goal setting, so that the involvement, the engagement, what be the words we have used, means systematically they clarify the kind of efforts required, and they also understand the kind of complexities involved. They also see the need for asking for resources, both in terms of the technology and in terms of the capacity to reach those set goals. The reviews become extremely important. So, this includes assessing the goal setting process itself and also the modifications required, and then continuously bringing that kind of a discipline of refocusing or refocusing their efforts, correcting the required attitudes, etc. So, as we are seeing this review and the goal setting process, one also has to see the kind of human resources, and that is where we are revisiting that organization development. And as we did this, the changes are there before the organization, then restructuring is there within the organization to respond, and then the need for managing changes at all levels and the required resistance. So, one need to see how to do this performance management in the overall context. I think that is where the OD, organization development, becomes much more relevant. So, when you are seeing this human resources, people can be a large fraction of the cost of doing business for any organization, which we have recognized already. But the question is that they certainly they can make the difference, but how, and how do you make sure that there is more of organizational success and less of organizational failure. And that is how you will need to see how to manage these changes, how to bring about changes, so that the success is most or more assured than the failure. So, that means one need to see the changing in the nature of the workplace, and the understanding the way the kind of aspirations are coming in the workplace, and why do people look for new opportunities, or why do they resist the change, and things like that. So, employees of today, if you see very clearly, they would like to have a feedback. They have to feedback on their performance. They also would like to have a kind of a feeling of sense of accomplishment. They also would like to see that they are considered as important individuals, not outliers, feeling of value and worth, and also their commitment to the social responsibility. So, that means the kind of overall concern they have about themselves to the society has to meet with the organizational activities, organizational tasks, organizational deliverables. So, if someone feels strongly that organization is not environmental friendly, or they are not doing that kind of a required green technologies, so the responses could be different. The question is, employees of today, they think little beyond, and then one need to understand what is that to be done. So, they need to be more efficient to improve their time management. In other words, as competitive pressure builds up, you cannot expect only to draw from their physical energies. So, that means they have to give their intellectual best. So, that means they have to manage their time, they have to schedule their tasks, and they have to be doing many things which goes beyond the normal call of the duty. And of course, if you are to continue doing the more work with less people, so then we need to make our processes more efficient. So, all the organizations are using this word today, the less is more. What the GE the General Electric, the CEO Jack Welch made that kind of a statement. So the less is more. So that means we are talking about less people and the lesser activities, but most efficient processes, and focusing on some of the best practices and delivering a value to the customers. So one can also see this when you are talking about OD. Whatever we did in the past was fine, but in the kind of the way the competitions are coming, we are addressing the global markets. And when you have to reach the global markets, capacities are important, competencies are important, technologies are important, processes are important, but on the whole all of these things need to be integrated. And we are also seeing that the survival is becoming one important issue, and then the prosperity and moving forward is another important thing. So both demands the kind of changes. The changes required at all levels, in all aspects of the organization. So organization need to be more responsible to and develop closer partnership with their customers. And that means unless you understand not only the organization, but also you need to see what other people are doing, other important stakeholders can help you to do things better. So the firms have to change to survive, and they should also attack the kind of problems they are facing. So it is not that only symptoms, but in a very systematic way, in a planned way, and in a humane manner. So that means you are creating an organization-wide change, and an organization-wide change engages all people, but not affecting them in any negative fashion. And also the kind of the planned change, we are also using this word today, the speed. So there is an accelerated rate of change. So that's where taking an open systems approach, now firms can identify the kind of sources of competition both at the national level as well as an international level, and where people, capital, physical resources and the information, every of these things become very, very relevant. I think that's what we are talking about, organization-wide change. And now who can do all this? I think that becomes an important thing. So to be successful, OD must have the buy-in, ownership and involvement of all stakeholders, not just of the employees throughout the organization. So that means OD is not done only to the employees or workers. OD is done at all levels, including the stakeholders, suppliers. So OD is usually facilitated by change agents. So in other words, who can see organization, its relationship with the different entities, and within the organization people or teams. So they must be able to see and then able to manage that kind of a change effort. So the change agents may be either the employees of the organization, referred to as the internal change agents or the internal consultants, or it could be the experts from the outside the organization, also can be referred to as external change agents or the external consultants. So the question is, the effective change requires leadership with knowledge and experience in change management. If these things are not there, if the CEOs or the leadership is not guided by this, then normally it results in the kind of failure. So several studies have reported this. It is strongly recommended that external or internal consultants must be used, and preferably a combination of both. So not only internal, sometimes it works very well internal people, sometimes it is desirable to use external. So question is the professionals, and best is that you can't create one and overnight. So it is important to see who are trained in the philosophy, in the technologies, and also the kind of attitudes what they have about the organization. So that is where we quickly run through some of the guidelines for the OD professionals. So they have a responsibility to self, so they act with integrity, they are authentic, and they're true to self. They strive continuously for self-knowledge and the personal growth. They themselves are prone to the change, and then they are, they recognize personal needs and desires, and they don't exploit the organizational thing. Let me give you an example. Though somebody was appointed as a consultant to bring about change in a research firm, but the question is that he thought that he can become the director of that particular lab. Now that's the time where the internal people would resist such attempts, and also in the particular situation he was also thrown out from the responsibility of the change agent. So in other words, one need to separate one's own self requirements as well as requirements of the organization. And very clearly one need to assert economic and financial interest in ways that are fair and equitable to the organization as well as to the clients. So it is extremely important that it is not a free service, it is a professional service, but the time, the commitments has to be stated at the beginning. And also the question of responsibility for professional development competencies. So one need to accept responsibility for the consequences of your acts. You cannot say that I am not responsible, because many times organization failure is due to, the change failures are due to several reasons, but change agent also must ensure a verifiable process of why successful or failures. So try to achieve and manage, maintain a kind of a professional involvement and professional engagement. As I said earlier, that one need to recognize personal needs and desires and deal with them responsibly, and the performance of professional roles are extremely important. And also practice within the limits of the competencies, culture and experience in providing services, and also using the kind of techniques. So an untrained person will not be of any great use to the organization. Similarly, responsibility to the clients and significant others. So one need to serve the long-term well-being of the organization, interests of the organization, and development of the client systems and all its stakeholders are very critical and important. So it is not just one-term, short-term kind of a thing. And conduct all the professional activities and programs and relationships in ways that are honest, responsible, and they are open. So that means always anybody can verify it. So data-based approaches, high level of participation, and particularly involvement in planning the activities always will help. So establishing mutual agreement on a contract covering the services and remuneration is very important. So deal with conflicts very constructively, and one need to avoid conflicts. So that means one need to state all the rules of the game as much as possible. And the defining and protecting the confidentiality of clients and professional relationships are very important, and making sure that the public statements of all kinds are very accurate, and then particularly when the promotion and advertising things are systematic. The question is that we need to see organizational change and then involve a change agent who is professional and professionally trained, who carries the required ethics and professional standards. So in the last two lectures we have seen particularly the various dimensions of organization development and how OD can be introduced and managed. Particularly in this lecture we had a close look at organizational change, the forms of organizational change, analytical approaches to organizational change, and change in the context of performance management, and why do we do organization development, who can do this OD, and some of the important things of values of an OD professional, both to the self, to the clients, and to the practice as a whole. And in the next one we will also see the following: that is about organizational theory, the open systems theory, the organizational subsystems, organizational environmental interface, and also reducing uncertainties and managing uncertainties.